a lone Lakota warrior in 1876, his face streaked with war paint, standing over a blood-soaked valley at Little Bighorn. The ground is littered with broken skulls, bones pierced by arrows, and the twisted remains of 268 U.S. soldiers, 210 of them fallen beside George Armstrong Custer. In just 90 minutes, the battle was over. A native fighter later said, "The soldiers fired wildly, then ran like frightened deer." This was no heroic last stand. It was a brutal rout, with the Lakota and Cheyenne rising as the true guardians of their land. What really turned this day so deadly? And why does the story still bury the bravery of the native warriors? Historical context. First, let's step into 1876. The Great Plains were a huge area in the middle of the United States, stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. This land was home to the Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, Arapaho, and other Native American tribes. These tribes had lived there for hundreds of years. They were nomadic hunters who followed the buffalo herds across the plains. The buffalo were everything to them. They used the animals for food, clothing, and even their teepee homes. In the mid-1800s, there were about 30 million buffalo roaming the plains, according to historian Andrew Eisenberg in his book The Destruction of the Bison. But by 1876, that number was dropping fast because of white settlers and hunters. The tribes depended on the buffalo to survive, and their way of life was strong and free. But the United States had other plans. The country was growing fast. It was only 100 years old in 1876, and many Americans believed in manifest destiny. This was the idea that they were meant to take over all the land, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. To do this, the U.S. government wanted to move the native tribes off the plains and onto reservations. Reservations were small pieces of land where the tribes were supposed to live under government control. By 1876, the government had already forced thousands of native people onto these reservations. For example, the U.S. Census in 1870 showed that over 300,000 Native Americans were living in the country, but many had lost their traditional lands. The trouble really started with gold. In 1874, miners found gold in the Black Hills. This area was in what is now South Dakota, and it was sacred to the Lakota Sioux. The U.S. government had signed the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868 with the Lakota and other tribes. This treaty said the Black Hills belonged to the Lakota forever. It also said no white people could come into the area without permission. But when gold was found, everything changed. By 1875, over 15,000 miners and settlers had rushed into the Black Hills, breaking the treaty. The government tried to buy the land from the Lakota for $6 million, but the Lakota refused. They did not want money. They wanted their land. Historian Robert Utley writes in The Lance and the Shield that this betrayal made the Lakota angry and ready to fight. The government then decided to use the army to take the land instead. In December 1875, the U.S. government sent out an order. It told all the Lakota, Cheyenne, and other tribes in the area to go to the reservations by January 31, 1876. If they did not, the army would come after them. Many tribes said no. They did not want to leave their homes and their freedom. This set the stage for a big fight. Now, let's talk about Sitting Bull. He was a leader of the Hunkpapa Lakota, one of the groups of the Sioux. Sitting Bull was born around 1831, and by 1876, he was about 45 years old. He was not just a warrior, he was also a holy man who had powerful visions. In the spring of 1876, he held a sun dance ceremony. During this, he saw a vision of U.S. soldiers falling upside down into a native camp. He believed this meant his people would win a big battle. This vision gave him strength. Sitting Bull used it to bring tribes together. By June 1876, He had gathered over 1,500 warriors from the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes. Some historians, like D. Brown in Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, say the camp had about 7,000 people total, including women and children. The camp was huge. It stretched along the Little Bighorn River in Montana for almost 3 miles. Sitting Bull's goal was clear. He wanted to protect his people and their way of life from the U.S. Army. On the other side was George Armstrong Custer. He was a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army, leading the 7th Cavalry Regiment. Custer was 36 years old in 1876. He had become famous during the Civil War, which ended in 1865. Back then, he led cavalry charges and won battles, earning the rank of Major General for a time. After the war, he went back to his regular rank, but he still wanted fame. In 1876, his regiment had about 600 soldiers. Custer was known for being bold, but also for taking risks. He had fought native tribes before. In 1868, he attacked a Cheyenne village on the Washita River and killed many people, including women and children. This made some people see him as a hero, but others thought he was cruel. Historian Jim Donovan in Custer and the Little Bighorn says Custer once bragged, "I could whip all the Indians on the continent with the 7th Cavalry." This shows how confident he was, maybe too confident. The clash at Little Bighorn came on June 25, 1876. The U.S. Army had a plan to attack the tribes from 3 sides. General Alfred Terry led one group from the east, with about 1,000 men. Colonel John Gibbon came from the west, with 450 soldiers. General George Crook was supposed to come from the south, with 1,300 men. Custer's 7th Cavalry was with Terry's group. The idea was to trap the native camp between these forces. But on June 17, Crook's group fought Crazy Horse, another Lakota leader, at the Battle of the Rosebud. Crook lost 28 men and had to pull back. This left Custer and Terry not knowing how strong the native warriors were. On June 22, Custer took his 600 men to find the native camp. His orders were to wait for Terry and Gibbon before attacking. But on June 25, his scouts saw the camp. It was bigger than he thought. There were between 1,500 and 2,000 warriors, according to estimates from historian Robert Utley. Custer's force was much smaller. Still, he decided to attack right away. He split his men into 3 groups. Major Marcus Reno took 140 soldiers to hit the south end of the camp. Captain Frederick Benteen took 120 men to check the South Hills. Custer kept 210 men with him to attack from the north. This split made his force weaker. The battle was quick and brutal. Reno's group attacked first, but got pushed back by the warriors. They ran across the river and up a hill, losing 40 men. Custer's group never reached the camp. The warriors, led by leaders like Crazy Horse and Gall, surrounded them. In less than an hour, all 210 of Custer's men were dead, including Custer himself. The native tribes lost between 30 and 100 warriors, though exact numbers are not clear. It was a huge win for Sitting Bull and his people. This battle echoed through history. It happened just before July 4, 1876, when the U.S. was celebrating 100 years as a nation. The loss of Custer and his men shocked Americans. The government sent more troops to the plains after that. By 1877, most of the Lakota and Cheyenne were forced onto reservations. Sitting Bull escaped to Canada, but came back in 1881 and died in 1890. The Battle of Little Bighorn was the last big win for the native tribes against the U.S. Army. Historian Robert Utley calls it the high water mark of their fight to stay free. After that, the U.S. took full control of the West. The battle, what went down? On June 25, 1876, George Armstrong Custer and his 7th Cavalry Regiment reached the Little Bighorn River in Montana. He had been sent to find a large camp of Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes, who had refused to go to reservations. That morning, his scouts spotted the camp. It was massive. The camp stretched along the river for about 3 miles. Historians say it had between 7,000 and 8,000 people, including women and children. Out of those, there were between 1,500 and 2,000 warriors ready to fight. Custer's total force was only 600 soldiers. He could have waited for General Alfred Terry, who was bringing more troops, but he didn't. Custer thought the native fighters would run if he delayed. So, he made a quick decision. He split his 600 men into 3 groups to attack the camp from different sides. Major Marcus Reno got 140 soldiers to hit the southern end. Captain Frederick Benteen took 120 men to check the hills south of the camp. Custer kept 210 men with him to strike from the north. This choice to divide his force set the stage for disaster. Custer didn't realize the native warriors already knew he was coming. Earlier that day, Reno's men had been seen by scouts from the camp. The warriors, led by men like Crazy Horse, Gall, and Two Moons, were prepared. When Reno attacked the southern end at around 3 p.m., his 140 soldiers faced hundreds of fighters. They were outnumbered fast. Reno lost 40 men in the first clash and had to retreat across the river to a hill. His group was pinned down there, fighting for hours. Meanwhile, Custer led his 210 men down a ridge toward the river. His plan was to cross and attack the camp from the north, but he never got close. After pushing Reno back, the warriors turned to face Custer's group. The battle that followed was quick and deadly. The fighting started on a ridge, now called Calhoun Hill. Custer's men tried to form skirmish lines there. A skirmish line is when soldiers spread out in a row to shoot at the enemy. Archaeological digs in the 1980s and 1990s, led by Richard Fox, found over 5,000 artifacts on the battlefield. These included 2,500 bullets and cartridge cases from both Army rifles and native guns. On Calhoun Hill, Fox's team found clusters of 7th Cavalry cartridge cases, about 200 in total, spread over 300 yards. This shows the soldiers tried to hold a line, but the warriors used the hills and ravines to surround them. Native fighters fired arrows and bullets from cover. Some had repeating rifles, like Henry and Winchester models, which could fire 15 shots without reloading. The Army's Springfield rifles could only fire 1 shot at a time. The evidence shows the skirmish lines broke fast. Fox counted that many soldiers fired fewer than 5 shots each before being overrun. A Lakota warrior named Iron Hawk later said the soldiers looked scared and fired their guns wildly as the warriors closed in. After Calhoun Hill fell, the surviving soldiers, maybe 100 or so, retreated to another spot called Last Stand Hill. This was about half a mile away. Custer was with them. They tried to regroup there, but it didn't work. The archaeological digs found 1,200 cartridge cases on Last Stand Hill, but most were from native guns. This means the warriors had gotten close, within 50 yards or less, and were shooting heavily. The soldiers' cartridge cases, about 300, were scattered in small groups, not in a tight circle. This shows they weren't standing together in an organized way. Historian Nathaniel Philbrick says in his book, The Last Stand, that the fighting here took less than 20 minutes. Custer was killed on this hill. His body was found near the top with 2 bullet wounds, one in the chest and one in the head. His brothers Tom and Boston and his nephew Audie Reed died nearby. Tom's body had 7 bullet wounds, showing how intense the attack was. In total, all 210 men with Custer were dead by the end. Some soldiers tried to escape from Last Stand Hill. About 20 to 30 ran downhill toward a gully called Deep Ravine, 300 yards away. They were looking for cover or a way out, but the warriors chased them. Cheyenne leader Two Moons later said the soldiers were running and fighting crazily as they fled. The digs found 150 bullets and 50 arrowheads in deep ravine, proving fighting happened there. No soldier bodies were found in the ravine, though. Historians like Douglas Scott think the bodies might have been moved later or washed away by rain. Either way, none of those men survived. The warriors cut them down before they could escape. The whole battle, from Reno's attack at 3 p.m. to the last shots on Last Stand Hill, lasted less than 2 hours. Custer's 210 men were wiped out. Reno and Benteen's groups survived, but lost 53 men total. The Native Alliance lost between 30 and 100 warriors, though exact numbers aren't clear because records differ. Some accounts, like Gall's, say 31 died, while others estimate up to 100. Either way, it was a huge victory for the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. They used their numbers, their weapons, and their knowledge of the land to crush Custer's force. Now, let's talk about the counterpoint. People have long believed Custer made a heroic last stand. The story says he and his men stood in a tight group, fighting bravely until the end. This idea started soon after the battle. In 1876, newspapers like the New York Herald called Custer a gallant leader who died with his men brave to the last. Paintings, like one from 1896 by Edgar Paxson, show Custer with his saber up, surrounded by soldiers in a circle. But the facts don't match this picture. Native accounts tell a different story. Lakota warrior Rain in the Face said many soldiers threw down their guns and raised their hands to surrender, but the warriors didn't stop. Another fighter, Low Dog, told historian Joseph Dixon that the soldiers ran like buffalo when the attack came. These stories say the battle was chaos, not a noble fight. The bullet patterns back this up. Richard Fox's study found 2,500 cartridge cases across a mile of the battlefield. Only 700 were from Army guns, and they were in small clumps, not one big group. On Last Stand Hill, the 300 Army cartridges were spread out, over 200 yards. This means the soldiers were scattered, running or hiding, not standing together. Fox says, in his book Archaeology, History, and Custer's Last Battle, that the fight was a rout, not a stand. The warriors' 1,800 cartridge cases show they overwhelmed the soldiers with firepower. Many bullets were from close range, under 20 yards, proving the soldiers couldn't hold their ground. Historian Brian Dippy says, in Custer's Last Stand, The Anatomy of an American Myth, that the heroic story grew because it fit what people wanted to believe. In 1876, right before the U.S. turned 100 years old, they needed a brave hero, not a messy defeat. So, the truth is clear. The Battle of Little Bighorn was not a long, heroic struggle. It was built into their bones. His 210 men crumbled under attack from 1,500 to 2,000 warriors. The skirmish lines on Calhoun Hill broke in minutes. The retreat to Last Stand Hill turned into panic. The flight to Deep Ravine ended in death. Native accounts and hard evidence, like 5,000 artifacts, show chaos ruled the day. The myth of Custer's bravery doesn't hold up. It's a story people told to feel better, but the facts tell us what really happened. Evidence. Digging up the truth. In the 1980s, archaeologists began a major investigation at the Little Bighorn battlefield, now a national monument in Montana. They wanted to find out what really happened on June 25, 1876, when George Custer and his 7th Cavalry fought the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. Using metal detectors and shovels, they swept the site and uncovered more than 5,000 artifacts. These included spent bullets, cartridge cases, broken sabers, arrowheads, and even pieces of clothing. They also found human remains that had been buried under the dirt for over 100 years. Historian Douglas Scott, who led the digs, said the battlefield was like a time capsule that held the secrets of that violent day. The team recovered exactly 5,243 items, according to Scott's reports, and each one helped tell the story of the battle. The artifacts showed clear evidence about the weapons used. Forensic experts studied the cartridge cases and found that the native warriors had 47 different types of firearms. These were not just bows and arrows, like some old stories claimed. They had guns like the Henry and Winchester repeating rifles, which could fire up to 15 rounds without reloading. For example, archaeologists found 354 Henry cartridge cases and 252 Winchester cases across the battlefield. These rifles gave the warriors a big advantage in speed. On the other hand, Custer's soldiers carried Springfield carbines, single-shot rifles that fired only one bullet at a time. Reloading took precious seconds, often 5 to 10 seconds per shot. At Last Stand Hill, where Custer died, the team found 1,200 cartridge cases from native guns, but only 300 from the soldiers' Springfields. That's a 4-to-1 difference in shots fired. Archaeologist Richard Fox studied this and said, the Indians had a significant advantage in firepower. This proves the native warriors could shoot faster and more often, overwhelming the soldiers. The human remains told an even grimmer story. Archaeologists dug up bones from both soldiers and native fighters. The soldiers' bones showed terrible injuries. Many skulls were crushed, likely from clubs or tomahawks. Some arms and legs were cut off completely. One soldier's femur, a thigh bone, had an arrowhead stuck in it, showing arrows were used along with guns. In total, they found remains of at least 34 soldiers across the site, scattered over a mile. The bones did not show a neat group standing together. Instead, they were spread out, some found 300 yards apart. Historian Nathaniel Philbrick wrote in his book, The Last Stand, the skeletal remains tell a story of chaos and violence, not organized resistance. This matches what the artifacts showed. The government then decided to use the army to take the land instead. They were running or fighting hand to hand, and they lost badly. The evidence proves this was a slaughter, not a heroic last stand. The bullet patterns gave more clues about how the battle happened. On Calhoun Hill, where the fight started, archaeologists found 127 Springfield cartridge cases from the soldiers. These were spread over 300 yards, not in one tight spot. This means the soldiers' lines broke apart fast. At Last Stand Hill, 1,200 native cartridge cases were found. In clusters around the soldiers, 300 cases. Douglas Scott analyzed this and said the native warriors surrounded the soldiers and shot from many directions. The soldiers fired back, but their bullets were scattered, showing they were moving, probably trying to escape. In one spot, near Deep Ravine, 45 soldier cartridge cases were found, 200 yards from the main group, proving some ran far before being killed. Richard Fox wrote in Archaeology, History and Custer's Last Battle, that the fight was a rout, not a stand. The evidence shows the native warriors attacked smartly, using the hills and ravines to trap Custer's men. Native accounts of the battle also match this evidence. For a long time, historians ignored what the Lakota and Cheyenne said. Now we know their stories were true. A Lakota warrior named Iron Hawk told historian David Humphreys Miller that the soldiers looked scared and fired their guns wildly. This fits the scattered bullet patterns. Another leader, Cheyenne warrior Two Moons, said the soldiers tried to run down the hill but got surrounded. At the site, archaeologists found 89 soldier cartridge cases near the bottom of a slope, showing they tried to flee. Historian Robert Utley said, the native oral histories are crucial to understanding the truth of Little Bighorn. The 5,243 artifacts and the bones back up what the warrior said. This was not a close fight. It was a fast, brutal victory for the native side. Fresh perspective. The data from the Little Bighorn battlefield rewrites the story. We've heard for years. People used to think Custer's last stand was a noble battle, where brave soldiers fought against huge numbers of native warriors. The evidence says something different. The native fighters didn't just win because there were more of them. They outsmarted and outgunned Custer's men. With 47 types of firearms, including 606 cartridge cases, from rapid-fire Henry and Winchester rifles, they had better weapons. The soldiers fired 300 Springfield shots at Last Stand Hill, but the natives fired 1,200 back. That's 4 times as many. The bones, with crushed skulls and severed limbs, show the soldiers were overwhelmed in close combat. The tactics were key too. The bullet patterns, like the 127 cases spread over 300 yards at Calhoun Hill, proved the soldiers' lines fell apart fast. The native warriors used the land, hiding in ravines and attacking from all sides. Douglas Scott's work showed they surrounded the 7th Cavalry and finished them off quickly, in less than an hour by some estimates. This wasn't a long, drawn-out fight. It was a smart, planned attack. The old idea that Custer's men stood together until the end isn't true. They were running, dying across a mile of ground, as the 34 scattered remains show. This evidence changes everything. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors were skilled and prepared. They had the tools and the know-how to beat a U.S. Army unit. The 5,243 artifacts dug up in the 1980s tell us the real story. It's not about Custer's bravery or bad luck. It's about native strength and victory. They didn't just overwhelm with numbers. They won because they were better fighters that day. The soldiers, faces of the fallen, who were Custer's men. They were mostly young immigrants with an average age of 22 and an average height of 5 feet 7 inches. These soldiers were not the tough, seasoned fighters you might picture. They were ordinary men, many of them new to America, and new to the Army. About 40% of the 7th Cavalry was born outside the United States. Historian John Gray, in his book Centennial Campaign, says that out of the 268 men who died with Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn, 98 were immigrants. They came from places like Ireland, Germany, England, and Italy. Ireland sent the most, with 43 of those 98 men. Germany gave 24, England 13, and Italy a few others. These numbers show how much the Army relied on foreign-born recruits. These men joined for practical reasons. The pay was $13 a month, which was low but steady. Most came from poor families. They had little education, often just a few years of school. Some could barely read or write. They saw the Army as a way to eat, to survive, and maybe to build a future. Their skeletons tell a hard tale. In the 1980s, archaeologists dug up the battlefield and studied the bones of Custer's men. What they found was grim. Many had bad teeth. Some teeth had cavities so big they were rotting away. Others were missing entirely or showed gum disease. This points to a rough diet. They ate hardtack, a dry cracker that could break teeth, along with salted pork and beans. Fresh food, like apples or carrots, was almost never on the menu. Historian James Donovan, in Custer and the Little Bighorn, says the 7th Cavalry had been on the trail for weeks before June 25, 1876, living on short rations. Some days, they got half a pound of hardtack and a few ounces of meat. That's not enough to keep a man strong. The skeletons also showed worn joints. Knees and backs were damaged, even in men as young as 20 or 22. Riding horses for 12 hours a day and carrying 50-pound packs wore them down. Some had old fractures, like a broken arm or leg, that healed crooked. Medical care was basic back then. A soldier might get a splint and some whiskey, then be told to keep going. There were signs of hunger too. Thin bones in some skeletons mean they didn't get enough food. For months, maybe years. Donovan writes that on the march to Little Bighorn, the men ate less than 1,500 calories a day. A soldier needs 3,000 or more to fight well. These were not crack troops. They were tired, underfed recruits. Out of the 600 men in the 7th Cavalry, about 200 had less than a year in the army. Some joined just months before the battle. The unit was under strength too. A full company should have 100 men, but some had only 40 or 50. Training was simple. They learned to march in a line, shoot a rifle, and ride a horse. But they didn't practice fighting fast-moving enemies, like the native warriors. On June 22, they started a long march. They covered over 70 miles in 3 days, with almost no sleep. On June 24, they rode until 2 a.m., rested for 3 hours, then moved again at dawn. By the time they reached the Little Bighorn River on June 25, they were dead on their feet. They faced 1,500 to 2,000 native warriors, a force 7 or 8 times their size. Custer had only 210 men with him in the final fight. They were led into a buzzsaw. The warriors had better weapons too. The soldiers carried Springfield rifles, which fired 1 shot at a time. Reloading took 5 to 10 seconds. The native fighters had repeating rifles, like the Henry and Winchester. These could fire 15 shots in 15 seconds. Archaeologists found 354 Henry cartridge cases and 252 Winchester cases on the battlefield. That's 606 shots from repeating rifles. Custer's men fired just 300 Springfield rounds at Last Stand Hill. The warriors fired back with 1,200 shots. The numbers show how badly outgunned they were. Analysis. Custer's bravado gets the spotlight, but his men's condition set the stage for collapse. George Armstrong Custer was a famous leader. He had long hair, a bright uniform, and a reputation for bold attacks. He fought in the Civil War and won big victories. People called him a hero. But at Little Bighorn, his luck ran out. He led 210 men into a fight they couldn't win. Why? His soldiers were not ready. Their average age was 22, so most were young and green. About 100 of the 210 spoke English as a second language. Orders got confused. Their bodies were weak from hunger and exhaustion. James Donovan writes, Custer's men were in no condition to fight a major engagement. They had marched 70 miles with little food or rest. Their rifles were slow, and their training was basic. The native warriors were different. They were in great shape. They ate fresh buffalo meat, not hardtack. They grew up riding horses and shooting bows. Historian Robert Utley, in The Lance and the Shield, says the warriors were in superb physical condition and knew the land perfectly. They could ride circles around the soldiers. The numbers prove it. Custer's 210 men faced 1,500 to 2,000 enemies. That's a ratio of 7 to 1 at least. The warriors fired 1,200 shots at Last Stand Hill. The soldiers managed only 300. Each man had 100 rounds when the fight started. So 210 men could have fired 21,000 shots. But they got off just 300. Why so few? They were too tired to reload fast. Their hands shook from hunger. Their joints ached from weeks on the trail. The warriors' repeating rifles gave them a huge edge. One warrior could fire 15 shots, while a soldier fired 1 or 2. Donovan says, the 7th Cavalry was a shadow of its former self, worn down by hard campaigning. Custer split his force into 3 parts, leaving his group with just 210. He thought he could surprise the enemy. He was wrong. The warriors surrounded them on a hill. The fight lasted less than an hour. Skeletons show crushed skulls and cut off limbs. The men didn't stand a chance. Custer's confidence couldn't fix his men's problems. He had beaten native tribes before, with fast attacks. But this time, his soldiers were too weak to keep up. Their bad teeth and worn joints slowed them down. Their empty stomachs left them dizzy. The army was small in 1876, with only 25,000 men total. The 7th Cavalry had 12 companies, but they were stretched thin. Recruits like Private William Taylor, age 19, had joined to help his family. Sergeant Jeremiah Finley, 28, had a wife and kids. They weren't warriors by trade. They were led into a trap by a leader who didn't see their limits. The native warriors fought for their homes. They had the strength, the weapons, and the numbers. So, the truth is clear. Their collapse was no surprise. It was built into their bones, tactics, and tools. The Battle of Little Bighorn, on June 25, 1876, was a fight decided by tactics and tools. George Custer and his 7th Cavalry used strategies and weapons they thought would win. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors had their own ways of fighting, and different tools that gave them the upper hand. This section looks at how each side fought, what they used, and why one side lost so badly. Everything here comes from history books, archaeological finds, and expert analysis, not guesses. The 7th Cavalry had a clear plan for battle. They relied on skirmish lines. In this tactic, soldiers spread out in a row. Each man stood about 5 yards from the next. They fired their rifles together at the enemy. This worked well in the Civil War. Back then, enemies often stood in lines too, or fought in open fields. At Little Bighorn, things were different. The land was rough, with hills, ravines, and tall grass. The native warriors did not stand still. They moved fast and used the terrain to hide. This made skirmish lines weak. Soldiers could not keep their formation when warriors got close. Custer also made a big choice. He split his 600 men into 3 groups. He took 210 men with him to attack from the north. Major Marcus Reno got 140 men to hit the south end of the native camp. Captain Frederick Benteen took 120 men to check the hills in the south. This split left each group smaller and far apart. They could not help each other fast enough. Historian Gregory Michno wrote in Lakota Noon, Custer's battalions were too far apart to support each other, and the Indians could concentrate on one at a time. Evidence backs this up. When Reno attacked, he faced hundreds of warriors and lost 40 men in minutes. His group ran back across the river. Custer's 210 men were then alone against 1,500 to 2,000 warriors. Archaeology shows how this failed. On Calhoun Hill, part of Custer's force tried to hold a skirmish line. Experts found 127 Springfield cartridge cases spread over 300 yards. This means the line stretched thin and broke apart. Warriors got within 50 yards, too close for the soldiers to reload and fire effectively. By the time Custer reached Last Stand Hill, his men were surrounded. The tactic did not match the enemy or the land. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors fought differently. They were hunters and horsemen, not trained soldiers. They did not use straight lines or fixed positions. Their tactics were flexible. They moved fast and attacked from all sides. One key move was encirclement. They surrounded the soldiers and hit them from every direction. This stopped the troops from running or regrouping. They also knew the land well. The battlefield had ravines, slopes, and ridges. Warriors hid in these spots, then popped up close to the soldiers. Leaders like Crazy Horse and Gall made smart calls. Gall, a Hunkpapa Lakota chief, saw Reno's attack in the south. He sent warriors to stop it. After pushing Reno back, they turned to Custer's group. In less than 30 minutes, Crazy Horse led charges that broke the soldiers' lines. Archaeologist Richard Fox studied the site. He found native cartridge cases just 50 yards from soldier positions. on Calhoun Hill. This shows warriors got very close before firing. Their speed and surprise were deadly. Numbers tell more. Estimates say 1,500 to 2,000 warriors fought. They did not all attack at once. They shifted groups to where they were needed. When Custer's 210 men reached the hill, hundreds of warriors focused on them. This flexibility let them overwhelm one battalion at a time. Weapons made a huge difference. The 7th Cavalry used Springfield carbines. These were single-shot rifles. A good soldier could fire 10 to 12 shots per minute. After each shot, they had to reload by hand. This took 5 to 10 seconds per bullet. They also had Colt revolvers with 6 shots. These were good up close, but reloading was slow in a fight. Each soldier carried 100 rifle rounds and 24 pistol rounds. For Custer's 210 men, that's 21,000 rifle shots and 5,040 pistol shots possible. But they did not get to use them all. The native warriors had better tools. Many used repeating rifles, like the Henry and Winchester. These guns fired 15 to 20 shots without reloading. A warrior could empty a 16-round Henry rifle in under a minute. Archaeologists found 354 Henry cartridge cases and 252 Winchester cases across the battlefield. They also found cases from 47 different types of firearms. This mix included older guns and trade weapons, but the repeaters stood out. At Last Stand Hill, 1,200 native cartridge cases were dug up. The soldiers left only 300 Springfield cases there. That's a 4-to-1 difference in shots fired. Bows and arrows were also key. A skilled warrior could shoot 20 arrows per minute. Over 100 arrowheads were found at the site. Some were stuck in soldier bones. One femur had an arrowhead buried in it. Another skull was pierced by an arrow. These weapons were quiet and fast. In close fights, warriors used clubs and tomahawks. Many soldiers' skulls were crushed, showing hand-to-hand combat happened. Horses were tools too. The 7th Cavalry's horses were worn out. They marched 70 miles in 3 days before June 25. They had little food or rest. This slowed them down. The native warriors' horses were fresh. They could ride fast, shoot from horseback, and chase soldiers who tried to flee. Experts have studied this battle for years. Robert Utley wrote in Cavalier, in Buckskin, that U.S. tactics were old. They were made for enemies who fought like European armies. The native warriors did not. They hit and ran, using speed over structure. Utley says, the Army's training was useless against an enemy that wouldn't stand and fight. John Gray, in Centennial Campaign, blames Custer's choices. He did not wait for General Terry's 1,000 extra men. Instead, he split his 600 and attacked. This let the warriors pick off each group. Nathaniel Philbrick, in The Last Stand, agrees. He writes, Custer's tactics were a recipe for disaster. He underestimated the enemy's numbers and fighting ability, and his men paid the price. The soldiers fired fewer shots because they were overrun fast. The 300 Springfield cases at Last Stand Hill mean each of Custer's 210 men fired about 1.4 shots on average there. They ran out of time. The native tactics were perfect for the fight. They used the land, their numbers, and their weapons together. They did not need to hold a spot. They just kept attacking until the soldiers gave up. Their 1,200 cartridge cases at Last Stand Hill show they kept firing, while the soldiers could not. The 7th Cavalry's tactics and tools did not fit the battle. Skirmish lines failed against fast, close attacks. Splitting the force made them weak. Their single-shot rifles could not keep up with repeating rifles, bows, and clubs. The native warriors fought smart. They used the terrain, surrounded their enemy, and brought better firepower. The numbers prove it, 1,200 native shots to 300 soldier shots at the end. Historians like Michno, Utley, Gray, and Philbrick all say the same thing. Custer's plan was rigid and wrong. The warrior's way was adaptable and won. This was not luck. It was skill and the right tools in the right hands. Aftermath and meaning. The Battle of Little Bighorn ended on June 25, 1876. By the end of that day, 268 U.S. soldiers were dead. This number included George Armstrong Custer and his 210 men from the 7th Cavalry. The native warriors left many of the soldiers' bodies mutilated. This was a ritual act for some Plains tribes, like the Lakota and Cheyenne. They believed that damaging the body would hurt the enemy's spirit. In the afterlife, for example, Custer's body was found with his eardrums pierced. Historians say this was likely because he ignored warnings about the danger. Not all bodies were mutilated, though. Some tribes did not follow this practice. The Native Alliance, made up of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, also lost fighters. Estimates of their deaths vary. Historian John Gray, in his book Centennial Campaign, says 30 to 40 warriors died. Other sources, like D. Brown's Berry, My Heart at Wounded Knee, suggest the number was closer to 100. This shows how hard it is to get exact figures for Native losses. The battle did not end with Custer's death. Other parts of the 7th Cavalry were still fighting nearby. Major Marcus Reno and Captain Frederick Benteen led about 400 soldiers. They were under attack on a hill called Reno Hill. The native warriors surrounded them and kept fighting. This siege lasted until June 26, when U.S. reinforcements arrived. The native forces then withdrew. In total, the U.S. lost 268 men and had 55 wounded. This number comes from John Gray's detailed study. In Centennial Campaign, the arrival of more troops forced the native warriors to leave, but their victory was already complete. The news of this defeat spread fast across the United States. It reached the public just before the country's centennial celebration. On July 4, 1876, newspapers reported the shocking story. On July 6, the New York Times published a headline, "Horrible Slaughter of Troops." People were stunned. Custer was a famous Civil War hero. Many could not believe he lost to native warriors, whom they called savages. This loss hurt American pride. The public demanded action. Congress responded quickly. They gave the army more money to fight the tribes. In 1876, there were only 2,500 U.S. troops in the West. By 1877, that number grew to over 10,000. Military records show this sharp increase. The government wanted revenge and control. For the native tribes, the victory at Little Bighorn was a proud moment. They had beaten a strong enemy. But this success did not last long. The U.S. Army came back with more power. They launched new campaigns to force the tribes onto reservations. By the end of 1877, most of the Lakota and Cheyenne had given up or been captured. Sitting Bull, a key Lakota leader, escaped to Canada after the battle. He stayed there until 1881, when he returned to the U.S. He surrendered and lived on a reservation. In 1890, he was killed during an arrest attempt. Another leader, Crazy Horse, surrendered in May 1877. He was killed in September, that year after a struggle with soldiers. The battle was a high point for the tribes, but it also started their defeat. Historian Nathaniel Philbrick, in The Last Stand, says it was a final stand before the inevitable. The U.S. also attacked the tribes' way of life in other ways. The buffalo was central to the Plains tribes' culture and economy. In the 1860s, there were millions of buffalo in the West. After Little Bighorn, the army and hunters killed them off. By 1880, only a few hundred remained. This number comes from government reports at the time. Without the buffalo, the tribes could not survive as they had before. They had no choice but to move to reservations. The battle led to this destruction. The meaning of Little Bighorn has changed over time. At first, Americans saw it as a tragedy. Custer was the focus. People wrote books and made paintings about his bravery. In 1941, a movie called They Died with Their Boots On showed him as a hero who died for his country. This story was popular for years. It ignored why the battle happened. The tribes were not just attacking, they were defending their land. In 1868, the Treaty of Fort Laramie gave the Black Hills to the Lakota. This land was sacred to them. Then, in 1874, gold was found there. Miners rushed in. The U.S. government tried to buy the Black Hills. The tribes said no. The army was sent to force them out. Historian Robert Utley, in The Lance and the Shield, says the battle was a fight for survival, not aggression. The native warriors showed great skill in the battle. They had smart tactics. They surrounded Custer's men and used the hills to hide their movements. They attacked from many directions at once. They also had good weapons. Archaeologists studied the battlefield. They found 354 cartridge cases from Henry rifles and 252 from Winchester rifles. These were repeating rifles, which could shoot faster than the soldiers' single-shot Springfields. The 7th Cavalry had 410 Springfield rifles and carbines. This evidence comes from a 1980s dig led by Douglas Scott. The native fighters had about 2,000 warriors. According to Utley's estimates, Custer had 647 men total in his command, but only 210 were with him when he died. The tribe's numbers and tactics gave them the win. Utley writes, "It was superb leadership and skill, not just luck." The battle affected U.S. policy too. It started big debates. Some people wanted better treatment for Native Americans. Helen Hunt Jackson wrote A Century of Dishonor in 1881. She used Little Bighorn to show how the government mistreated tribes. Others wanted tougher rules. In the end, the U.S. chose to force the tribes onto reservations. By 1890, most native lands were gone. The Census Bureau said that year there was no more frontier left in America. Little Bighorn helped make this happen. Today, the battle means something different to Native Americans. It is a symbol of strength. They see it as a time when they fought back and won. Joseph Marshall, the third, a Lakota historian, wrote in The Day the World Ended at Little Bighorn. It was a victory for survival, not conquest. For them, it is not about Custer. It is about their people standing together. The battlefield is now a national monument. Over 300,000 people visit it each year, according to park records. They come to learn both sides of the story. The aftermath of Little Bighorn was a turning point. It led to more U.S. troops in the West. It ended the tribe's free life on the plains. The Army's campaigns after the battle crushed their resistance. By 1880, the Lakota and Cheyenne were on reservations. The buffalo were nearly gone. The U.S. won in the end. But the battle also showed the world the tribe's courage and skill. Historians like Philbrick say it was a brief triumph in a losing war. The numbers tell the story. 268 soldiers dead, 30 to 100 warriors lost, 10,000 troops sent, millions of buffalo killed. These facts show the cost and the change. In conclusion, Little Bighorn was more than a fight. It was the last big win for the Plains tribes. It forced the U.S. to rethink its plans. It destroyed the old native life, but left a legacy of pride. The evidence is clear. The battle's aftermath shaped the West. Its meaning still matters today. So, Custer's last stand? It was more a frantic fall than a noble fight. The evidence reveals a chaotic battle where Custer's men were swiftly overwhelmed, far from the heroic tale often told. Yet, amidst that turmoil, the Lakota and Cheyenne warriors emerge as powerful figures. They shone brightly, not just as fighters, but as defenders of their world, their land, and their people. Their courage and determination defined that day. As we close this chapter, the story challenges us. to look beyond the myths. Too often, history has sidelined their victory, favoring a narrative that dims their brilliance. But their stand was real, their triumph undeniable. So here's a thought to ponder. How do we keep their courage alive in a history that's too frequently written over them? How do we honor all the voices of the past, not just the ones that fit the familiar tale?